Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier, and this is the first presentation in what will be a series that will look at the effects of World War I. Paper 2 considers economic and social impacts, and more specifically the impact on women and marginalised groups. It also considers the impact of the peace treaties. Paper 3 looks at the same in the regional study on Europe and the First World War, but the regional studies covering the Russian Revolution and Japan are also impacted by the effects of World War I, so there's a lot to cover. Now, there are a number of ways of looking at the effects of wars. Wars can be seen as a catalyst for change, like World War I and the Russian Revolution, or as accelerating processes already in motion, so that changes should be seen within long-term trends, like the change in the status of women after World War I, with some women gaining the vote. But war can also hinder change. For example, it may have seemed at first that World War I ushered in democracy in Germany, but in fact it made it very difficult for democracy to take hold, and we all know what happened in the 1930s. Change might be government-driven, like the territorial changes mooted by governments with World War I underway. I'm thinking of the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. Or it might be unplanned, unanticipated consequences of war, and here I'm thinking of the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And as wars have made greater demands on countries and their resources, human as well as economic, governments have had to adopt social reforms in order for the country to be fit to fight. Linked to this view, war can be seen as testing institutions and ideas, testing their fitness. The 1918 electoral reform in Britain wasn't just about votes for women, some women at least. It was about universal suffrage for men too. War can also lead to international changes, radical shifts in the balance of power as empires collapse and new nations are formed, new institutions too, for example the League of Nations, as well as changes in world trade. After World War I, America increasingly dominated the world economy, a trend that would accelerate after World War II. Nations can be traumatized by war, particularly if they have suffered a bad defeat. It can have a psychological impact on a nation as well as on its individuals. Look at Weimar Germany. Similarly, victory can result in an inflated national ego. If the first condition can be damaging, the second can be dangerous. Just how arrogant were the Big Three when they met to decide the fate of the defeated nations at the Paris Peace Conference? War can generate cross-class national solidarity, a concern for the less privileged amongst those better off. That men had made the ultimate sacrifice led to universal suffrage in Britain after World War I, and Lloyd George committed his government to homes fit for heroes, high-quality public housing for returning soldiers and their families. Or war can highlight and even widen social differences, back to the Russian revolutions. But changes brought about by war may be short-lived, or at least their impact minimised by elites regrouping. Ultimately, however, war is destructive. It takes lives and it disrupts life and the normal working of economies, often destroying the ability for an economy to function, either because it has been bankrupted or its physical infrastructure has been destroyed. This needs to be made good. In St. Petersburg, Vienna, Berlin, Paris and London, the cost of war placed a heavy burden on the business of recovery and good government. Though the Great Flu pandemic of 1918 added to the problems that governments in Europe faced in the aftermath of the total war that was World War I. How to make a lasting peace after World War I was a pressing priority, and what we were left with was an imperfect peace. Of course, the losers, those blamed for the war, were unhappy with the dictated terms of their different treaties. But even the raft of successor states, successors to the old empires of Russia, Germany, Austria-Hungary and Turkey, created on the principle of self-determination, were unhappy with the borders that had been drawn on their behalf, though not so unhappy as the minorities within their borders, as well as in the changed borders of established states, notably Germans in Poland, Czechoslovakia and Italy, Magyars in Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia and Romania, and Bulgarians in Romania and Greece. If any of these countries wanted to pick a fight, they didn't have to look too hard to find an excuse. The post-war normality in Europe was marked by social and political upheaval, as well as by political violence. 2 revolutions and a civil war in Russia, bands of uniformed and armed ex-soldiers fighting on the streets of Berlin and other German cities, assassinations and putches, some successful, some not, from the left and the right in different countries, as revolution, counter-revolution and civil war seemed to be the new norm. France was a country traumatised and divided by the experience of World War I, whilst Britain faced the outbreak of civil war in Ireland and ultimately the creation of the Irish Free State. There would also be civil war in Spain. Little wonder that politics lurched to the extremes of left and right, to communism or to fascism. It's hard to imagine the rise of power of Lenin, and so Stalin, as well as Mussolini, without World War I. And though the Great Depression was a big factor, it's also hard to imagine the rise of Hitler. So, as I said, lots to cover. I think this gives you plenty to reflect on. World War I was a catalyst for change, but continuity too, not least nationalism and the persistent German question. Now don't forget, there's my website, History Made Easier, that's there to help you too. Do check it out if you haven't already done so. And I may still have a tutorial slot free if you think you would benefit from that. You should know the drill. Just get your parents to contact me at historymadeeasier@gmail.com. But for now, let me thank you for listening and wish you the very best of luck with your studies. Cheers.